Welcome back. In this fourth video, I was hoping to start doing some practical work with telescopes and cameras and such, but the weather's been absolutely atrocious and I'm going to have to wait for a while. So in the meantime, I thought we'd take a look at another way of bringing in targets into a sequence and using one of the tools within SGP. And at the same time, just take a quick look at calibration frames as well. So I'm going to use a tool that's actually built into SGP called the Framing and Mosaic Wizard. And in the initial versions of SGP, this was an upgrade, but you need to check your version of SGP because sometimes it's included and sometimes not. Before just hitting that button, what I would suggest you do is create a blank sequence with the profile that you want to use, your equipment profile. So in this case, I'm going to be using my EOS on an EQ5. And if I look at the telescope tab, just to check the focal length is correct, it has a scope focal length of 430mm, which is quite wide. That focal length is ideal for a wide field subject, which is what I have in mind. So I'm just going to shut these dialogues down for a second and bring up the tool, which is under the Tools menu, Framing and Mosaic Wizard. And what it brings up is a very clever little dialog box which has target information up here, information about the camera, and then how to define the area you want to actually image, and then creating the sequence. So at the top you can define the target by typing in the name of it or an astrobin or URL reference. You can equally bring in an image file and it can plate solve it, or actually type in some coordinates and it'll bring in this, an area around that area. So I'm going to use an object and type in Heart Nebula. And hitting return, it brings up a picture of the Heart Nebula. So I can now draw on there a frame for where my camera will be. So first of all, it's picked up from the sequence and from the control panel the default parameters for the camera. That's why I created a dummy sequence in the first place. So this is the pixel dimensions of the EOS camera, and I've got a scale of just over 2 arcseconds per pixel. And I'm going to overlap my mosaic frames by 20%, which is a fairly generous overlap. So what you can do is do a number of different things with your mouse. You can draw the target rectangle, move it and pan it. So I'm just going to take the mouse and drag an area on the screen. And if you notice, what's happened is that if I just fit to screen, the actual image has gone off the screen. So what I now can do is just drag it onto the screen. Now the centre is not particularly in the middle of the centre of the Heart Nebula is not in the middle of the image. So what I'm going to do is increase this to 4 degrees, which will give me a little bit more space. And hopefully that'll bring up a slightly wider field of view, which means I can fit my entire camera on there. So there we go. Oh, it's turned colour. So what I can now do is drag my frame on here. Now, because I've dragged the frame slightly too large, you can see that it's created a mosaic of 2 by 2 tiles. And you can create a mosaic in this way, and this shows the overlap regions between the separate tiles. But if you just reduce this down to 1 by 1, it allows you just to set the targets for a single frame, which is quite handy. Now obviously if that's the wrong angle, you can alter the angle so that you get everything in. That looks about right. And then you can create a sequence. So I'm just going to cheat for a second and I'm going to make it 2 tiles high, just because I want to show something else that's rather clever with the Mosaic Wizard. So if I now say create a sequence, it will give me a sequence with the name Heart Nebula, and it's going to, in this case, append targets to the sequence. I want to slew and center so that they're accurately lined up on where they're meant to be, and rotate or validate the camera angle. So if you have a rotator, it'll move it. If you can manually rotate it and you're wrong, it'll instruct you to rotate the camera until it's correct. And there's a third button here that says associate a working image with the sequence, which means when you open the sequence, this picture on the screen pops up just to remind you what you're doing. I don't really need that, so I'm going to get rid of that and hit OK. And it's created some targets. So let's have a look at the targets, and here they are. So it's left the first one alone. In fact, I don't need that, so I can get rid of it. And it's got Heart Nebula 1 and 2, and each one has slightly different coordinates, which is aligned to the mosaic. So for instance, you can obviously realize that this could be a single tile, just a simple, one tile subject, but it can also be a dozen or so. And the clever thing with this is, if I now define an exposure sequence, so let's bring in a light frame, no filters, exposure time of 5 minutes, ISO 800, and a repeat of 100. And let's say this is a very bright object, so I might do some very short exposures because it allows me to cope with the brightness range. Rather than having to type that all in again for the second target of the mosaic, I can simply right-click this one and then say copy event settings from Heart Nebula 1. And so when I click on that one, I have all the same event settings between the two targets. So that's quite a neat way of creating a target. You don't need an external planetarium. What Sequence Generator Pro is doing is it's looking at the deep sky survey pictures for that particular coordinate system and pulling them in. So that's quite a handy way of doing either a multi-tile or a single tile sequence. The other thing which I was going to explain about was doing calibration frames. Now, I don't particularly use it, but there are options in here to do flats immediately after taking image frames, and they can be automatically calibrated if you have a system that can alter light levels and so forth. On a more simple level, if you bring up your sequence, at the end of this you could, for instance, put in a pause. So bring up the event settings and do pause sequence before, and then put on lens cap, and down here do a set of darks and biases, and obviously the darks would have the same exposure times as the ones above, so I actually need to insert a new one, dark as well, 30 seconds. Oops. And repeat, so maybe 50 darks, 50 biases, 50 darks. So for instance here, having completed the mosaic, it will pause, prompt you to put the lens cap on, and then it'll go on and take your dark and bias frames, which is more relevant to something like an EOS camera where you can't temperature control it. On a thermally regulated camera, you can obviously do the darks and biases at any time. So that's just a little thing to think about, and hopefully the weather will get better soon and I can start looking at running the sequence in anger and setting it up and autofocus and all those other good things. So thanks for watching, and goodbye.